here we go. And by the way, I'm going to try to do this using Substack's new recording studio, whatever they call it. And I'm going to see if I can do some editing. I don't think I can do anything like I can do with editing software. So if you have an opinion on whether my Savigny podcast, I've done one episode, is easier to listen to because it's fully edited. I did that on editing software and then went through it and edited it to essentially be perfect. Or the podcasts I've done before, which are simply recording audio as if it was radio. So you get all the mistakes, which I really don't like, but maybe I just have to learn to live with it. Or if you like what I get out of this, which is using Substack's recording studio, feel free to give me your opinion. Give me your opinion about anything. Glad to talk to you. All right, Book 4 of Montesquieu's The Spirit of Laws is titled, That the Laws of Education Should be Relative to the Principles of the Government. In Book 4, Montesquieu argues that education must be adapted to the fundamental principle or driving spirit of each type of government to ensure its preservation and stability. Montesquieu's core message in Book 4 of The Spirit of Laws, that the laws of education ought to be in relation to the principles of government, stands as a pointed critique of any universalist approach to education, including modern ones that impose a single model, for example, standardized global curricula, liberal democratic citizenship training, as if, or human rights-focused programs, regardless of regime type, people, culture, or local spirit. Montesquieu is explicit. Education is not a neutral or universal toolkit for human flourishing. It is the first and most powerful instrument for instilling the animating principle that actually sustains each form of government, and, I would add, each society. Without the right education, the regime and civilization itself collapses into corruption. In a republic, especially democracy, education should instill political virtue, a demanding self-renunciation where citizens love the laws and country more than themselves, constantly preferring the public good to private interest. This requires rigorous, comprehensive training, as in ancient examples like Sparta or Plato's ideal republic. Because virtue is difficult and arduous. In a monarchy, things are different. Education focuses on cultivating honor, the sense of rank, distinction, ambition, and noble behavior. It is less formal academic and more shaped by real-life examples, court life, noble conduct, teaching people to seek esteem, glory, and beautiful actions rather than strict moral virtue. In despotism, which may sound familiar to some of you when I describe it, education is minimal or absent. As the regime relies on fear, extreme obedience thrives on ignorance rather than cultivated principles. Go to any mall in the West these days and tell me about honor, virtue, and cultivated principles. Montesquieu stresses that the laws of education are the first impressions preparing citizens for civil life, and they must align with the regime's sustaining principle. Otherwise, the government and indeed the society cannot endure. And now, Book 4. That the laws of education ought to be in relation to the principles of government. 1. Of the laws of education. The laws of education are the first impressions we receive, and as they prepare us for civil life, every private family ought to be governed by the plan of that great household, which comprehends them all. If the people in general have a principle, their constituent parts, that is, the several families, will have one also. The laws of education will be therefore different in each species of government. In monarchies, they will have honor for their object. In republics, virtue. In despotic governments, fear. 2. Of education in monarchies. In monarchies, the principal branch of education is not taught in colleges or academies. It commences, in some measure, at our setting out in the world, for this is the school of what we call honor, that universal preceptor, which ought everywhere to be our guide. Here it is that we constantly hear 3 rules or maxims: that we should have a certain nobleness in our virtues, a kind of frankness in our morals, and a particular politeness in our behavior. The virtues we are here taught are less what we owe to others than to ourselves. They are not so much what draws us towards society as what distinguishes us from our fellow citizens. Here the actions of men are judged, not as virtuous, but as shining, not as just, but as great, not as reasonable, but as extraordinary. Beautiful, beautiful, a beautiful bill. When honor here meets with anything noble in our actions, it is either a judge that approves them or a sophist by whom they are excused. It allows of gallantry when united with the idea of sensible affection, or with that of conquest. This is the reason why we never meet with so strict a purity of morals in monarchies as in republican governments. It allows of cunning and craft when joined with the notion of greatness of soul or importance of affairs, as, for instance, in politics, with fitnesses of which it is far from being offended. It does not forbid adulation, save when separated from the idea of a large fortune, and connected only with the sense of our mean condition. With regard to morals, I have observed that the education of monarchies ought to admit of a certain frankness and open carriage. Truth, therefore, in conversation is here a necessary point. But is it for the sake of truth? By no means. Truth is requisite only because a person habituated to veracity has an air of boldness and freedom. And indeed, a man of this stamp seems to lay a stress only on the things themselves, not on the manner in which they are received. Hence it is that in proportion as this kind of frankness is commended, that of the common people is despised, which has nothing but truth and simplicity for its object. In fine, the education of monarchies requires a certain politeness of behavior. Man, a sociable animal, is formed to please in society, and a person that would break through the rules of decency so as to shock those he conversed with would lose the public esteem and become incapable of doing any good. But politeness, generally speaking, does not derive its origin from so pure a source. It arises from a desire of distinguishing ourselves. It is pride that renders us polite. We are flattered with being taken notice of for behavior that shows we are not of mean condition, and that we have not been bred with those who in all ages are considered the scum of the people. Politeness in monarchies is naturalized at court. One man excessively great renders everybody else little. Hence, that regard which is paid to our fellow subjects. Hence, that politeness equally pleasing to those by whom as to those towards whom it is practiced, because it gives people to understand that a person actually belongs, or at least deserves to belong, to the court. A courtly air consists in quitting a real for a borrowed greatness. The latter pleases the courtier more than the former. It inspires him with a certain disdainful modesty, which shows itself externally but whose pride insensibly diminishes in proportion to its distance from the source of this greatness. At court, we find a delicacy of taste in everything, a delicacy arising from the constant use of the superfluities of life, from the variety and especially the satiety of pleasures, with the multiplicity and even confusion of fancies, which, if they are but agreeable, are sure of being well received. These are the things which properly fall within the province of education, in order to form what we call a man of honor, a man possessed of all the qualities and virtues requisite in this kind of government. Here it is that honor interferes with everything, mixing even with people's manner of thinking and directing their very principles. To this whimsical honor it is owing that the virtues are only just what it pleases. It adds rules of its own invention to everything prescribed to us. It extends or limits our duties according to its own fancy, whether they proceed from religion, politics, or morality. There is nothing so strongly inculcated in monarchies by the laws, by religion and honor, as submission to the prince's will. But this very honor tells us that the prince never ought to command a dishonorable action, because this would render us incapable of serving him. As an aside, an important point: the sublayers of society, the intermediary institutions, actually perform a very important role in limiting the power of the monarch, believe it or not. Crillon refused to assassinate the Duke of Guise, but offered to fight him. After the massacre at St. Bartholomew, Charles IX, having sent orders to the governors in several provinces for the Huguenots to be murdered, Viscount d'Ort, who commanded at Bayonne, wrote thus to the king: "Sire, among the inhabitants of this town and your majesty's troops, I could not find so much as one executioner. They are honest citizens and brave soldiers. We jointly therefore beseech your majesty to command our arms and lives in things that are practicable." This great and generous soul looked upon a base action as a thing impossible. Imagine that. That would be a nice rule to apply to our society. There is nothing that honor more strongly recommends to the nobility than to serve their prince in a military capacity. And indeed, this is their favorite profession, because its dangers, its success, and even its miscarriages are the road to grandeur. Yet this very law of its own making, honor chooses to explain, and in case of an affront, it requires or permits us to retire. It insists also that we should be at liberty either to seek or to reject employments, a liberty which it prefers even to an ample fortune. Honor, therefore, has its supreme laws, to which education is obliged to conform. The chief of these are that we are permitted to set a value upon our fortune, but are absolutely forbidden to set any upon our lives. The second is that when we are raised to a post or preferment, we should never do or permit anything which may seem to imply that we look upon ourselves as inferior to the rank we hold. The third is that those things which honor forbids are more rigorously forbidden, when the laws do not concur in the prohibition, and those it commands are more strongly insisted upon, when they happen not to be commanded by law. 3. Of education in a despotic government. As education in monarchies tends to raise and ennoble the mind, in despotic governments, its only aim is to debase it. Here, it must necessarily be servile. Even in power, such as an education will be an advantage, because every tyrant is at the same time a slave. Excessive obedience supposes ignorance in the person that obeys. The same it supposes in him that commands, for he has no occasion to deliberate, to doubt, to reason. He has only to will. In despotic states, each house is a separate government. As education therefore consists chiefly in social converse, it must be here very much limited. All it does is to strike the heart with fear and to imprint on the understanding a very simple notion of a few principles of religion. Learning here proves dangerous, emulation fatal, and as to virtue, Aristotle cannot think that there is any one virtue belonging to slaves. If so, education in despotic countries is confined within a very narrow compass. Here, therefore, education is in some measure needless. To give something, one must take away everything, and begin with making a bad subject in order to make a good slave. For why should education take pains in forming a good citizen, only to make him share in the public misery? If he loves his country, he will strive to relax the springs of government. If he miscarries, he will be undone. If he succeeds, he must expose himself, the prince, and his country to ruin. 4. Difference between the effects of ancient and modern education. Most of the ancients lived under governments that had virtue for their principle. And when this was in full vigor, they performed actions unusual in our times, and at which our narrow minds are astonished. Another advantage their education possessed over ours was that it never could be effaced by contrary impressions. Epaminondas, the last year of his life, said, heard, beheld, and performed the very same things as at the age to which he received the first principles of his education. In our days, we receive 3 different or contrary educations, namely, of our parents, of our masters, and of the world. What we learn in the latter effaces all the ideas of the former. This, in some measure, arises from the contrast we experience between our religious and worldly engagements, a thing unknown to the ancients. 5. Of education in a republican government. It is in a republican government that the whole power of education is required. The fear of despotic governments naturally arises of itself amidst threats and punishments. The honor of monarchies is favored by the passions and favors them in its turn. But virtue is a self-renunciation, which is ever arduous and painful. This virtue may be defined as the love of the laws and of our country. As such, love requires a constant preference of public to private interest. It is the source of all private virtues, for they are nothing more than this very preference itself. This love is peculiar to democracies. In these alone, the government is entrusted to private citizens. Now, a government is like everything else. To preserve it, we must love it. Has it ever been known that kings were not fond of monarchy, or that despotic princes hated arbitrary power? Everything, therefore, depends on establishing this love in a republic, and to inspire it ought to be the principal business of education. But the surest way of instilling it into children is for parents to set them an example. Oh, just my luck. Someone's security just went off. Oh well, you will have to bear with as I will. People have it generally in their power to communicate their ideas to their children, but they are still better able to transfuse their passions. If it happens otherwise, it is because the impressions made at home are effaced by those they have received abroad. It is not the young people that degenerate. They are not spoiled till those of mature age are already sunk into corruption. And may some despotic government deal with that guy's car. 6 of really annoying car alarms going off during my podcast. No, 6 is actually of some institutions among the Greeks. He's been dealt with, thankfully. The ancient Greeks, convinced of the necessity that people who live under a popular government should be trained up to virtue, made very singular institutions in order to inspire it. Upon seeing in the life of Lycurgus the laws that legislator gave to the Lacedaemonians, I imagined I'm reading the history of the Severambes. The laws of Crete were the model of those of Sparta, and those of Plato reformed them. Let us reflect here a little on the extensive genius with which those legislators must have been endowed to perceive that by striking at received customs and by confounding all manner of virtues, they should display their wisdom to the universe. Lycurgus, by blending theft with the spirit of justice, the hardest servitude with excess of liberty, the most rigid sentiments with the greatest moderation, gave stability to the city. He seemed to deprive her of all resources such as arts, commerce, money, and walls. Ambition prevailed among the citizens without hopes of improving their fortune. They had natural sentiments without the tie of a son, husband, or father. And chastity was stripped even of modesty and shame. This was the road that led Sparta to grandeur and glory. And so infallible were these institutions that it signified nothing to gain a victory over that republic without subverting her polity. By these laws, Crete and Laconia were governed. Sparta was the last that fell a prey to the Lacedaemonians, and Crete to the Romans. The Samnites had the same institutions, which furnished those very Romans with the subject of 24 triumphs. A character so extraordinary in the institutions of Greece has shown itself lately in the dregs and corruptions of modern times. A very honest legislator has formed a people to whom probity seems as natural as bravery to the Spartans. Mr. Penn is a real Lycurgus, and though the former made peace his principal aim, as the latter did war, yet they resemble one another in the singular way of living to which they reduced their people. In the ascendant they had over free men, in the prejudices they overcame, and in the passions which they subdued. Another example we have from Paraguay. This has been the subject of an invidious charge against a society that considers the pleasure of commanding as the only happiness in life. But it will be ever a glorious undertaking to render a government subservient to human happiness. It is glorious indeed for this society to have been the first in pointing out to those countries the idea of religion joined with that of humanity. By comparing the devastations of the Spaniards, she has begun to heal one of the most dangerous wounds that the human species ever received. An exquisite sensibility to whatever she distinguishes by the name of honor, joined to her zeal for a religion which is far more humbling in respect to those who receive than to those who preach its doctrines, has set her upon vast undertakings which she has accomplished with success. She has drawn wild people from the woods, secured them a maintenance, and clothed their nakedness. And had she only by this step improved the industry of mankind, it should have been sufficient to eternize her fame. They who shall attempt hereafter to introduce like institutions must establish the community of goods as prescribed in Plato's Republic. That high respect he required for the gods, that separation from strangers for the preservation of morals, and an extensive commerce carried on by the community, and not by private citizens. They must give our arts without our luxury, and our wants without our desires. They must prescribe money, the effects of which are to swell people's fortunes beyond the bounds prescribed by nature, to learn to preserve for no purpose what has been idly hoarded up, to multiply without end our desires, and to supply the sterility of nature, from whom we have received very scanty means of inflaming our passions and of corrupting each other. The epidemians, perceiving their morals depraved by conversing with barbarians, chose a magistrate by making all contracts and sales in the name and behalf of the city. Commerce, then, does not corrupt the Constitution, and the Constitution does not deprive society of the advantage of commerce. 7. In what cases the singular institutions may be of service. Institutions of this kind may be proper in republics because they have virtue for their principle. But to excite men to honor in monarchies or to inspire fear in despotic governments, less trouble is necessary. Besides, they can take place but in a small state, in which there is a possibility of general education and of training up the body of people like a single family. The laws of Minos, of Lycurgus, and of Plato suppose a particular attention and care which the citizens ought to have over one another's conduct. But an attention of this kind cannot be expected in the confusion and multitude of affairs in which a large nation is entangled. In institutions of this kind, money, as we have above observed, must be banished. But in great societies, the multiplicity, variety, embarrassment, and importance of affairs, as well as the facility of purchasing and the slowness of exchange, require common measure. In order to support or extend our power, we must be possessed of the means to which, by the unanimous consent of mankind, this power is annexed. 8. Explanation of a paradox of the ancients in respect to manners. That judicious writer Polybius informs us that music was necessary to soften the manners of the Arcadians, who lived in a cold, gloomy country. That the inhabitants of Sineti, who slighted music, were the cruelest of all the Greeks, and that no other town was so immersed in luxury and debauchery. Plato is not afraid to affirm that there is no possibility of making a change in music without altering the frame of government. Aristotle, who seems to have written his Politics only in order to contradict Plato, agrees with him, notwithstanding, in regard to the power and influence of music over the manners of the people. This was also the opinion of Theophrastus of Plutarch, and of all the ancients, an opinion grounded on mature reflection, being one of the principles of their polity. Thus it was they enacted laws, and thus they required that cities should be governed. This, I fancy, must be explained in the following manner. It is observed that in the cities of Greece, especially those whose principal object was war, all lucrative arts and professions were considered unworthy of a free man. Most arts, says Xenophon, corrupt and enervate the bodies of those that exercise them. They oblige them to sit in the shade or near the fire. They can find no leisure, either for their friends or for the republic. It was only by the corruption of some democracies that artisans became freemen. This we learn from Aristotle, who maintains that a well-regulated republic will never give them the right and freedom of the city. Agriculture was likewise a servile profession and generally practiced by the inhabitants of conquered countries, such as the Helots among the Lacedaemonians, the Parisians among the Cretans, the Panestes among the Thessalians, and other conquered people in other republics. In fine, Every kind of low commerce was infamous among the Greeks, as it obliged a citizen to serve and wait on a slave, on a lodger or a stranger. This was a notion that clashed with the spirit of Greek liberty. Hence, Plato, in his laws, orders a citizen to be punished if he attempts to concern himself with trade. Thus, in the Greek republics, the magistrates were extremely embarrassed. They would not have the citizens apply themselves to trade, to agriculture, or to the arts, and yet they would not have them idle. They found, therefore, employment for them in gymnic and military exercises, and none else were allowed by their institution. Hence, the Greeks must be considered as a society of wrestlers and boxers. Now, these exercises having a natural tendency to render people hardy and fierce, there was a necessity for tempering them with others that might soften their manners. For this purpose, music, which influences the mind by means of the corporal organs, was extremely proper. It is a kind of medium between manly exercises, which harden the body, and speculative sciences, which are apt to render us unsociable and sour. It cannot be said that music inspired virtue, for this would be inconceivable, but it prevented the effects of a savage institution and enabled the soul to have such a share in the education as it could never have had without the assistance of harmony. Let us suppose among ourselves a society of men so passionately fond of hunting as to make it their sole employment. They would doubtless contract thereby a kind of rusticity and fierceness. But if they happen to imbibe a taste for music, we should quickly perceive a sensible difference in their customs and manners. In short, the exercises used by the Greeks could raise but one kind of passions: fierceness, indignation, and cruelty. But music excites all these, and is likewise able to inspire the soul with a sense of pity, lenity, tenderness, and love. Our moral writers, who declaim so vehemently against the stage, sufficiently demonstrate the power of music over the mind. If the society above mentioned were to have no other music than that of drums and the sound of the trumpet, would it not be more difficult to accomplish this end than by the more melting tones of softer harmony? The ancients were therefore in the right when under particular circumstances they preferred one mode to another in regard to manners. But some will ask, why should music be pitched upon as preferable to any other entertainment? It is because of all sensible pleasures there is none that less corrupts the soul. I don't know if Montesquieu heard some of the music we are forced to listen to. Corrupts the soul. Okay. We blush to read in Plutarch that the Thebans, in order to soften the manners of their youth, authorized by law a passion which ought to be prescribed by all nations. Next time, Book 5.